Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started. Starting with the fabric. This is a scuba crepe, so it's a little bit textured on the outside, nice and smooth on the inside, and this one has stretch in both directions. And then for lining on my Peplum, I'm using this gorgeous lilac coloured viscose. And on to the cutting out. This is my back. I have a notch just to indicate where my zip will end, and one dart in this one, snipping those dart legs and popping a pin in at the point. Ready for marking. So I'm just using my chalk pen here and drawing in my dart legs. So that's those done on both sides. Ready to pin. So I'm just lining up my notches, popping my pin in through that chalk line on top, out through the line on the bottom, and back up through again. A pin at the point of the dart, and ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the dart legs, back stitching, and then following that chalk mark the whole way up to the point, and pulling my threads to finish. I'll give that dart a press and tie off my threads, and this is the result. Happy with that, and now these pieces are ready to be joined to the front at the side seams. So on to the front. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have one dart that I'll mark in exactly the same way as I did the back, and ready to stitch. And once I've tied off my threads and pressed, this is how it looks. So that's my front all prepped and ready to be joined to my back. My fabric is right sides together, lining up my edges and pinning into place, and ready to stitch. So I just need to finish that edge on the overlocker and press out that seam, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And now that that's done, I'm ready to work on the Peplum. So I have one layer of scuba fabric underneath my pattern piece, and then I have some notches along that top edge to indicate the folds. I'll come back to that later on. So that's the front part of my Peplum cut out and notched and ready to be joined to the back at that side seam. So on to the back. Same thing again here, I have one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece. And here, just laying that back right sides together with my front at the side seam and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. So just like the side seam of my skirt, I need to finish that edge on the overlocker and press, and this is how it looks. And now this piece is ready for its lining. So I'll finish my edges like before on the overlocker and press. And this is the result. And the first thing to do here is to join these pieces along that bottom edge. My fabrics are right sides together. I've pinned and ready to stitch. That's that done. And you can see here that I've just ran those edges through the overlocker, and here I'm just pressing it and my lining fabric away from the scuba, making sure that that edge is butted up against the lining fabric, using my pressing cloth to try and prevent any unwanted sheen in preparation for understitching. So you can see here that my overlocked edge is underneath my lining. I'm stitching through the lining, through that overlocked edge, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the scuba fabric. And what this will do is help to keep that lining fabric tucked in underneath the scuba and not peek out too much where I don't want it to peek out too much, using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. I've given that a good press, which you can see here. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up those side seams. So laying my fabric right sides together and pinning into place. And I'm going to stitch that short end from the hem right up to the waist, and then the longer end from the hem up to that top pin. That's just going to leave me a little bit of room at the top to join my peplum along the centre back seam. You'll see that in a second. So that's both sides sewn up, and off camera I've just finished those edges, clipped my corners and turned everything through to the right side and pressed. Happy with that. And now to make the next steps a little bit easier, I just want to join these two fabrics together along the waist, just to stop anything shifting around when I'm trying to add this to the skirt. So I'm just running a tacking stitch within my seam allowance the whole way along that waist. And now that that's done, I'm ready to add in my pleats. So I'm just picking the fabric up at that first notch you see me snip, folding it back to the second notch, making sure that top edge is all in line, and pinning into place. Exactly the same thing for the second pleat. And just like before, I'm going to run a stitch line over the top just to hold these pleats in place so they don't move about when I'm trying to add my peplum to my skirt. So that's those all tacked into place. And that finishes all of the prep work required for my peplum. So now I can add it to my skirt. So just laying it over the top, wrong side of peplum to right side of skirt, lining up my edges, lining up my notches, and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. So I'm first of all joining the peplum along that centre back seam, just on that little gap that I left earlier, pivoting at the top and straight across the waist. And again, sewing here within my seam allowance, just to hold my peplum into place. So now that those two are joined together, I can work on my waistband. My fabric underneath my pattern piece is on the fold. I have notches at the top and bottom of the fold line. And I'm cutting this piece out twice. Laying one of those pieces over the top of my skirt, lining up my notches, my fabric is right sides together, and pinning, and ready to stitch. And this time stitching at my 1 cm seam allowance. That will hide all of those tacking stitches. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. So now that my waist piece and skirt are joined together, I can work on my centre back. So in preparation, I've ran my hem and that centre back seam through the overlocker. I'm just pinning my peplum out of the way, lining up my notches, lining up my waist and pinning. And I'm going to stitch from the top of my slit to the bottom of my zip with a normal stitch length, and then above my zip notch with the longest stitch length on my machine. So just coming up to that notch, back stitching, adjusting my stitch length, and sewing the whole way up to the top with the longest stitch length on my machine. And this little bit of preparation is just going to help me insert my zip as accurately as I can. So I just need to press that seam open, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And for this skirt, I've decided on a concealed zip. So I've just laid that on top of that press seam, and before I stitch this down permanently, I'm going to hand tack it into place. So that's that all hand tacked into place. So now I can remove those machine tacking stitches. As I said before, all of these steps are just helping me to make sure that my zip is sewn in as accurately as I can get it. So using my standard zipper foot, I've placed my needle as close to the teeth as I can get. Back stitching to start and to finish. So that's the first side all sewn down. I'll do exactly the same to the second, and this is the result. So my peplum is all attached there at the top. My zip is neatly in place where I want it to be, thankfully. So just to remove those tacking threads and add a little bit of finish to the zip. So this is just a strip of the lining fabric. I'm lining it up with the seam on one side and stitching into place. And this will not only give a nice finish on the inside, but it will also protect my skin from that zipper tape. And I've given that a good press, and that completes my zip installation. So happy with that. So now I just have a couple more things to do to complete this skirt. The first of which is to add that second waist piece. So just laying it right sides together, lining up my notches and pinning. And when I've pinned, I folded that bottom edge up by my 1 centimeter seam allowance. This will just help me out when I come to sew this edge down later on. And I'm sewing here right along the edge of the zip on that center back, pivot at the top, and then straight across the waist. Now I did make a mistake here, so you can see that that little piece of lining fabric, I'm stitching it into the waist. That is not correct. So I did fix it afterwards, but if you were doing something similar yourself, you would want to ensure that the top part of that little lining piece is kept separate to that top waistline. You'll see in a second that I've rectified it and how it actually should sit. So that's my two waist pieces joined together, and you can see just on the bottom right of the screen here, I've unpicked that little bit of lining fabric so that it sits away from that top edge. So that's my mistake rectified. So before I can close my waistband completely, I just want to run a line of understitching along that edge, just like I did before in the Peplum. So I've pressed that seam allowance away from the skirt, and I'm stitching using a little bit of a longer stitch length, about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam. And just like before, this is just going to help this little bit of fabric to stay nicely tucked in underneath. So that's at a good press. I've pinned along that top edge just to make sure nothing shifts when I complete my next step, which is to hand stitch that bottom seam into place. So I'm just picking up a little bit of the fabric right along that bottom stitch line, then a little bit of the fabric along the edge of the waist, back down to that stitch line, and repeating. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. Happy with that. And now the very last thing I have to do is just to hand stitch that hem and slit into place. So I've just mitered my corners and pressed by my allowance and pinned into place. And here I'm just running a herringbone stitch right along that edge. So picking up a little bit of the fabric from the skirt, and then at a diagonal down to the hem, at a diagonal back to the skirt, and repeating. And once it's all done and pressed, this is how it looks. And with that, this little skirt is complete. I've got my zip at the centre back, got that little bit of lining fabric protecting my skin, my waistband all in place, my peplum nicely attached to that centre back seam, bit of shaping there with my back darts, same thing on the front, and then this skirt's main feature, that gorgeous asymmetric with its contrast lining tiered peplum. And this is how it looks on. So I am super happy with how this has turned out. This is my first time attempting this tiered design. I love the folds in the peplum, and I love how the contrast lining just pokes out. I love that it's asymmetric. I think it just gives it a little bit of something different. I love the length of the skirt. I love the high waistband, and then that super practical split at the back. I love this scuba crepe fabric. It makes for the most comfortable garments. Very happy with this one. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks.